Hi, I'm Alara, and this is the story of how my sister's graduation became the day I stopped waiting to be invited and started taking back what was mine. They didn't just leave my name off the program, they left it off the deed, the photographs, the future. But what they never expected was that the quiet daughter, the one they thought was easy to erase, was also the one who remembered everything. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. I knew it the moment I saw my name wasn't on the envelope. This wasn't an oversight. It was a message. The envelope came tucked inside a stack of community mail that Mrs. Harper handed me with a smile and a warm, "Big day coming for your family, huh?" She didn't notice the way my fingers froze when I flipped it over and saw the return address. Town Hall, Graduation Committee. I already knew what was inside before I slid it open with the edge of my house key. The printed invitation was glossy, decorated with gold foil stars and a crimson ribbon looped at the corner. The Winslow family cordially invites you to celebrate Tessa Winslow, class of 2023, it said. Names followed in bold script: Margot and Douglas Winslow, honored guests, Aunt Helen, Uncle Craig, even Tessa's high school math teacher, but not mine. The breath left me quietly, like someone had pinched a balloon behind my ribs. I didn't want to believe it. So I called. Margot answered on the second ring. Yes? Her voice was clipped, like she'd been expecting this. I got the envelope, I said. I'm not on the list. A pause. Then, with that smooth composure she reserved for press interviews and church potlucks, she said, Elara, let's not make this complicated. This day is about Tessa. We need it to look right. I wasn't going to wear a clown costume, Mom. Don't be dramatic. You know what I mean. I didn't reply. I knew arguing wouldn't change anything. That evening, I walked through Main Street and saw the bakery had already hung Tessa's photo in the window. Her in that crimson cap and gown, all teeth and eyes and future. Underneath, our shining light. I stood outside until my reflection started to blend with hers in the glass. Then I walked home, climbed the stairs to my apartment above the library, and sat on the carpet in silence. There, beneath my bed, was the old storage box labeled Trust Records, Grandma Esther. I hadn't opened it in years. Dust coated the lid like a seal. But tonight, the lock gave out easily. Inside, I found folders, a paperclip chain, handwritten notes from Grandma, and a small yellowing envelope with my name on it in her script. I set it aside, not ready yet. I was still thinking about Margot's words, how cleanly she'd shut the door without ever raising her voice. Fine. If they want to erase me, they'll remember why I mattered. I wasn't looking for revenge, just a reason. But reasons leave breadcrumbs if you know where to look. I spent most of the next morning in the library's archive room, where the air always smelled like old books and lemon cleaner. The lights hummed faintly, and the windows trembled every time the early summer wind pushed against them. I told Jody I was reorganizing donor records. Technically true. The Winslow name came up often. Margot had made sure of that. Plaques, reading room dedications, even a shelf labeled Legacy Corner. I traced one brass nameplate with my finger. Years ago it read The Winslow Sisters. Now it just says, In honor of Tessa Winslow, our future. I pulled the property binder from the legal archives cabinet, the one Grandma Esther's estate should have been filed under. Inside, receipts and deeds had been neatly scanned and sorted. I flipped through them until a file labeled Transfer Authorization, Bar Harbor, made me pause. There it was. my name. Elara Winslow, listed as having signed over her share of the property to the family foundation. I stared at the signature. The S in Winslow curled wrong. The L was lazy. It wasn't mine. I took a photo with my phone and opened my old lease agreement, the one I'd signed years ago when I first moved into the apartment above the library. Side by side, the signatures didn't match. Just then, Jody peeked in and said, "Your mom dropped off updated documents last week. She said it was for tax alignment." I felt my hands clench, though I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did she mention which files?" Jody shrugged. "Mostly donation forms, some estate updates." Later, I stepped outside for air and sat on the concrete bench near the flagpole. The wind tugged at the edge of my scarf, but I didn't notice until someone sat beside me. "I heard you were looking through old records," Mr. Quinn said. His cane rested lightly against his leg. I nodded. "Just piecing things together." He looked at me gently. "You once brought me soup after my stroke. Now maybe it's my turn to help." Realizing I was lied to, disinherited, cast out of my family. Why did this happen to me? Have you ever felt like I do now? If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now let's get to the next development of this story. I used to believe being invisible was safer, but ghosts don't get justice. Only the living do. That morning, the apartment was unusually quiet. No footfalls from the floor above, no humming air vents from the library below. Just me, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and the pale blue light of my laptop screen. The shared family drive was still accessible. They had forgotten to revoke my access, or maybe assumed I'd never look. I clicked through folder after folder until I saw one marked Holdings Final. It was buried deep, behind innocuous titles like Photos and Reports. Inside, a PDF labeled Sale Confirmation, Bar Harbor Property. I opened it, and my breath caught. It listed Harlow Holdings as the buyer. The transaction dated just 2 months ago. But what stopped me cold was the deed section, signed by Elara Winslow. Again, that wrong loop in the L, that flat, formless S. The same fraud. This time, final. I didn't cry. I closed the file slowly, like it might bite me if I moved too fast. Then I grabbed my coat and walked to the coffee shop near the courthouse, a place where Mom used to hold donor breakfasts. The barista, a kid I recognized from the high school's yearbook staff, smiled. "Sad about the Bar Harbor place, huh? Your mom said it's helping fund Tessa's nonprofit launch." I blinked. "She said that?" He nodded. "Just last week. Proud moment," she said. I stepped outside, the bell over the door still ringing behind me, and leaned against the brick wall. Proud. They'd sold the one place that ever felt like mine to build Tessa's future, while telling the world I didn't belong in the past. I didn't go home. I walked instead, back toward the library, but stopped short when I saw Mr. Quinn sitting on the bench outside with a folder in his hands. Without a word, he stood, walked toward me, and gently placed it into mine. "That's the original will. I was asked to hold it, by your grandmother. I think it's time." I didn't want a seat anymore, but I did want the truth to be heard by someone besides myself. Mr. Quinn and I sat in a modest law office above a bookstore in downtown Providence. The blinds were pulled halfway to keep out the glare, and the scent of aging pages drifted up from the shop below. A quiet hum from the ceiling fan filled the silence as I unfolded the will in front of the estate attorney. Philip Green was a silver-haired man in a corduroy blazer. He read slowly, his eyes narrowing as he reached the 3rd page. "This predates the version currently filed," he said, adjusting his glasses. "And it names you as primary heir. not the foundation. I nodded, hands still. It also lists the Bar Harbor property, and I have evidence the deed was transferred with a forged signature. Philip raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. I continued, sliding over a folder with side-by-side signature samples and the photo I'd taken of the digital document. I also have voice recordings, I added, and one email draft from Tessa that might help. He tapped the folder lightly. You understand what this means? I swallowed. It means I stop hoping for a seat and start drawing the line. Philip gave a slow nod. We'll file for a petition and injunction. Quietly at first. Mr. Quinn remained silent the entire time, but his presence steadied me. Before we left, Philip handed me 2 envelopes. One was the court copy, the other was mine to deliver personally. That afternoon, I walked back to my apartment and sat at the dining table, now covered with folders, highlighters, and old birthday cards from another life. I pulled out a piece of stationery, cream-colored, with faint floral embossing in the corners, and wrote the note I should have written years ago. You left me out. This time, I step in. I folded it carefully, slid it into the envelope with the legal notice, and wrote Margot's office address in my neatest script. As I dropped it into the post box at the end of my street, a voice behind me said, Ms. Winslow, do you have a comment on the Caldwell Trust revision and the foundation freeze? My name was finally called in a courtroom, not as a problem, but as a rightful heir. The room was smaller than I expected. No marble columns, no dramatic echoes, just wood paneling, worn carpet, and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Still, when the clerk called, Miss Winslow, I stood straighter. Philip Green sat beside me, calm as always, shuffling the folders we'd prepared. Across the aisle sat my parents, Margot in her signature navy dress and pearl earrings, Douglas looking down at his hands like they might save him from what was coming. Tessa sat next to them, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. The judge was a woman in her early 60s. Her voice didn't rise or fall much. She simply listened. Philip began with the documents, the original will, the comparison of signatures, the financial logs. He spoke with quiet authority, never accusing, just presenting. When the audio played, my mother's voice saying, Alara doesn't project the family image, a flicker crossed Tessa's face. She shifted slightly, but didn't speak. Then came Douglas's voice, low and casual. She used to read everything. I could feel my throat tighten, but I kept my eyes forward. Mr. Quinn testified next. He explained how my grandmother had asked him to safeguard the will after a stroke made her unsure whom to trust. Why didn't you come forward earlier? The judge asked. He looked over at me. Because she wasn't ready, but she is now. Then, unexpectedly, the judge called on Tessa. She stood, her hands trembling slightly. I found out about the changes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know the full extent, but I didn't stop it either. I was afraid of ruining things. The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was soft, heavy. Margot opened her mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand. Mrs. Winslow, the court has heard enough. She turned back to me. Miss Winslow, this court finds the prior will valid. The Bar Harbor estate shall revert to you. The foundation's disbursements are frozen pending audit. I nodded once. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. We filed out in silence. As I reached the hallway, Tessa touched my arm and slipped a folded note into my palm. I'm sorry. You deserved better. Maybe someday we'll talk again. They never offered me a chair at their table, so I built my own and left it open for those who needed it most. The Bar Harbor house didn't look the same anymore. The shutters had been repainted, and the porch swing no longer creaked. Still, when I stood barefoot in the front room and watched the morning light spill across the floorboards, I recognized the feeling, like I could breathe again. We'd transformed the space quietly. No press release, no ribbon cutting, just paint, elbow grease, and a lot of late-night grant applications. It was now a literacy and arts retreat for foster teens, kids who, like me, had been left out of pictures too many times. That afternoon, we held a small open house for the first group of teens. Folding chairs, lemonade, a table covered with sketchbooks and notebooks. They read poems out loud, some about grief, others about hope. I listened from the back row, my heart both full and aching. Near the end, a girl named Jamie stood up, holding something covered with a checkered cloth. "We all helped," she said, "to say thank you." She lifted the cloth, revealing a cake, slightly lopsided, iced with too much frosting, and decorated with gummy bears and the words, "Thank you, Alara." I blinked hard. It wasn't the cake. It was the fact that they thought to make one. They didn't know how many birthdays I'd spent alone. They didn't know about the pinched smiles or the silent rooms, but they made room for me anyway. Later, as I stood by the front steps watching the sun melt into the horizon, I reread the letter from Tessa. No excuses, no defense. Just a line. "Thank you for showing me who you really are." I folded it carefully and placed it into a small wooden box beside my grandmother's will. I didn't keep them out of bitterness. I kept them because they marked something real. Proof that I lived, I showed up, I stayed kind. This house would have become anything. I chose this. A space where someone could walk in and feel seen. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be invited in. I was already home. Some silences don't wound, they make space. In that sunlit room by the sea, surrounded by mismatched chairs and young voices, I didn't feel erased anymore. I felt chosen. Kindness, when given freely and without expectation, becomes a legacy far stronger than any name engraved on a plaque. When we stop judging by appearances, we start seeing people for who they truly are and who they've quietly become. So if this story reminded you of someone who's been left out too long, maybe today is the day you invite them back in. Not with fanfare, just with a seat.